Join me today for a conversation with novelist Allen Plexico.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. It is my intention with this show to bring you an exciting guest each and every Wednesday so we can learn from each other and become better game masters and better role players. Now, right at this time, I am going to stop babbling and just dive right into today's interview. My guest today is award-winning author and podcaster, Allen Plexico. Van, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks very much, Matt. I really appreciate you having me on.
When did you realize you were a writer?
I don't think was ever a time I didn't. I was, I've told the story before that when I was in preschool or kindergarten, I was trying to write stories, but I couldn't write yet. I wasn't literate, so I was dictating stories to my dad and my sister to write down until I learned how to actually write. So it's just something that I've always done. I was, reading Star Trek novels, the earliest ones, the Haldeman ones back in kindergarten, first grade, and thinking this is just the greatest thing ever. Just writing always to me seemed like the most appealing activity that you could do. And I always wanted to do it. I always had stories percolating in mind when I would be reading or watching things. And so it just, I remember I always was very impatient to get better because I always knew when I was younger, I knew I wasn't writing well, but I knew that I wanted to. And so it's the one thing, I guess everybody's got something in life they've worked to get better at their entire life, like every day. And whether it's juggling, or being an artist or whatever. And writing is just the one thing I've worked at every day pretty much of my life to try to be better and better at. So I've always wanted to write.
When did you publish your first novel?
I self-published the first 3 Sentinel superhero novels to no acclaim whatsoever about 2005, and they were just kind of out there with nobody buying them or reading them. And I would take them to various conventions and things, but it wasn't anything anybody cared about. And then Permuted Press decided to start a superhero side publishing venture, along with their main zombie apocalypse type publishing. And I was one of the 3 writers they approached because they had seen my 3 books out there and knew that I had I had a product prepackaged ready to go. And so they really liked them. And so they put the first 3 out. And then after that, I had a science fiction novel, Lucian, which is one of my most popular books. And it had sat around unpublished for several years. And so I got to be friends with some people that were published by Airship 27, by Ron Fourier and Rob Davis. And so I met them at a convention in Chicago. And so they were willing to take a look at Lucian, and they did, and they published it. And so I had the 3 superhero novels and the 1 science fiction novel out there. And then there was really just no turning back after that. I've been published by several different publishers in several different areas of writing, fiction and nonfiction. But it all really got started by just putting stuff out there and letting it be exposed to, anybody that might be interested in it.
Now, you mentioned the Sentinel novels were superhero novels. Why did you choose to write about superheroes?
Yeah, it's funny because the 2 great loves that I had in reading always in my life were, science fiction type stuff. And, whether it be from Dune to Ringworld, Larry Niven, Roger Zelazny, all that. And then I loved Marvel's Avengers. I was an Avengers and Iron Man fan back in the early mid 70s. In elementary school, we were reading, the David Michelinie and Bob Layton Iron Man, and the Jim Shooter, George Perez Avengers back in the day. And I loved those. And so I knew I was always drawing little comic books, but when I was a kid, but I couldn't draw. I'm a terrible artist. I've tried for years. I'm a failed, many times tried artist. And so I just never was having any success getting together with artists to do superhero stories. And so a friend of mine named Bobby Polite, he and I had the same ideas about doing these kind of stories, but neither one of us were artists. And so we decided, why don't we do a bunch of short stories that would tell the same sort of stories you'd read in a comic book, but we can just write them as prose. And this was back in around 1995, 96, when there really wasn't a lot of superhero prose out there, nothing like there is now. You had Marvel and DC would occasionally put out a novel, but they were very much subservient to the comics. In other words, nothing could happen in a Marvel or DC novel that would change the status quo from the comics. Nobody could die. Nothing important could happen. The important things in superhero stories had to happen in their comics. And so we were really among the very first to write original superhero stories where things could actually happen and change and characters could die and momentous things could happen, because the novels and the short stories were the primary, medium of the story being told, those characters being told. And so that's what kind of caught on with our friends at first and other people, was the idea that you could read these novels and get the same sort of stories that you'd get in a comic book format, but a lot more story, because it's prose. You're not having to wait on artists to do all the illustration. And they could be dynamic, that things could happen that wouldn't happen in a sort of a conventional superhero prose story. So when Bobby and I started doing that, I figured out that was something I was actually good at. I could tell. I like to describe it as using superhero characters as the characters in a science fiction novel. So let me give you a quick example. If you're writing a Star Trek novel, Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, they might as well be superheroes. Their superpower is they can travel around the galaxy faster than light. They can go from a planet's surface up into orbit and back, and they can shoot laser beams, right? They just have equipment that does that for them. Their science, their technology. Well, Bobby and I were writing the Sentinels and writing superhero and villain characters, but they have superpowers that do the same thing the technology would do in like a Star Trek novel. So we're writing pulp action adventure, but the characters were superheroes rather than spacemen, stormtroopers or bounty hunters or whatever else. And that was, I think, it just seems in retrospect so obvious that would make sense and that would work. But we were kind of pioneers doing that. We're not the only ones, but we were among the few first doing that, probably 25 years ago or so.
Why do you think superheroes kind of just endures as a genre?
Yeah, and because there's so many different ways of doing them, I think, is part of it. They're colorful. Usually their motivations are pretty much on the surface. Just like with pulp heroes of the 30s and 40s, like the Shadow and Doc Savage, it's very much what you see is what you get. It's and doing them in prose, I always tried to describe scenes and describe characters as if you're looking at a 4-color comic book, right? I kind of kept to very basic color schemes and very basic descriptions and emphasize the characters and the action. So I think that superheroes are a type of story that works in a lot of formats. It's funny because, when we started writing those stories, there really weren't any big superhero movies other than like the Richard Donner Superman and the Batman with Michael Keaton, and that was about it. So, we know today with everything the MCU has done, we know that superheroes work great in other media, like movies, for example, when you have CGI and all. But back then there was still some doubt if superheroes were really meant to be in anything other than comic books. And so, I feel like it's a popular subgenre. It has a lot of visual appeal, and when you can translate that into prose, I think you really got something. And that's what we've always tried to do with these stories.
You had mentioned like the Shadow and Doc Savage. What do you think the change in some heroes, right? Because you had the Shadow, Doc Savage, and then of course leading into like Superman. Those characters could do anything. and they did it well. Well, of course, like Doc Savage, and didn't have any superpowers at all, but he could just do everything.
Right.
What about the change to the more kind of modern superhero who's maybe broken and kind of brooding or something like that?
Well, it's just basically a walk through the 20th century of superheroes and pulp publishing, really, right? Because when it was more just black and white prose, they were writing crime buster stories. The popular thing then, when there were fewer illustrations, was the masked vigilante in the big city. And they didn't have, they might have flaws, like the Spider was a maniac, or the Avenger had a melted face or whatever, but these were still, very clear cut characters. Like you say, they were very black and white, not just in terms of the printing, but how they actually behaved and all. And then, you get Superman and characters like that come along, because it's getting more visual. You got more color printing. And so starting in 38 with Superman, you get, it moves toward, you still have a very clear cut good and evil, good guy, bad guy. And that had its appeal for, generations of readers. But yeah, I think that you really have to get to the Silver Age and the dawn of characters. First you had like some of the DC ones like the Flash, but really I think it's Marvel in 62, 63 with Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four is where you really get, and DC did a little bit of it with Green Lantern and Green Arrow with some of their adventures, but you get that period where a new generation is coming along and they want stories to be a bit more sophisticated. They want more shades of gray. They want more real life, involvement. And so you go from Metropolis, this perfect idealist utopian city, to New York City, a city that actually exists. It has real problems where Peter Parker can't pay his aunt's rent, and stuff. And then I would even argue that as big of a revolution as Marvel in the Silver Age was in the 60s, I think that comics today have even moved beyond, at least as far, because today you have comics that really have a much more adult sensibility, and they're really trying to emulate movies in a way. And so I think basically the medium of comics is constantly evolving. And I think that superheroes will always, in America at least, be the preeminent thing that's featured in that medium. But in other countries, it's other things, of course. But I just think it works very well. Only with these big $1 billion movies do you have, the money, the technology to do the Avengers, to do Guardians of the Galaxy and make it look good. But comics is just so easy to reproduce that. You can show planets exploding and Galactus eating worlds and all that in a comic, and it's easy. So yeah, I just think that really superheroes are very well adapted to the medium that they've always been in primarily. And they have a lasting appeal that can be used in other media like I do. But yeah, there'll always be superhero comics, I think.
If somebody wants to see what superhero movies look like other than the Richard Donner Superman and the Tim Burton Batman movies, they can check out the 1990 Captain America movie, and they will see that it had some problems.
No, exactly. Yeah, it's really not until probably X-Men in 2000 that we really start the modern era of really good-looking superhero movies.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That was the first one that really just blew me away. Just absolutely blew me away. And then, of course, Iron Man kicking off the MCU.
Absolutely.
Now, you also mentioned, you said you had a book called Lucian?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I have, I've written, I've lost track now, but I've written something like 17, 18 novels. Mm-hmm. And other than the recent Vegas Heist, which is my first foray into sort of period crime, where it's, Vegas Heist is set in 1965, and it's about a band of guys taking Route 66 down from St. Louis to knock over Caesar's Palace when it opens up on New Year's Day of 66. And so that was me kind of wanting to write an Ocean's 11, a Donald Westlake caper, you know what I mean? Yeah. I'd always wanted to do that, and I'd never really branched out into that area. So I did it, and it won Best Novel of the Year last year in the Pulp Factory Awards. So that was very gratifying. But other than that one, other than that foray into 1965, I have 2 novel series, and each one of them has about 9 books in it. The first one is the Sentinels we're talking about. There's 9 Sentinels novels, 3 trilogies, which tell one big, complete, giant, cosmic superhero story with tons of characters and heroes and villains and aliens and everything. But the other novel series I have is sort of a disjointed series. It's loosely connected universe. It's called The Shattering. It started with Lucian, Dark God's Homecoming, which is basically a Loki type character. And I wrote this actually back in the 2002, 2003, well before the Marvel movies gave us the current Loki. But when he came along, I'm like, hey, that's kind of like my Lucian character. But he's a cosmic Jack Kirby type god character who is basically the god of mischief and evil. And the whole idea of Lucian is that in this far future universe, it's kind of a science fiction Star Wars-ish universe, but it has these cosmic gods that are in it. And he's been in exile for being bad. And after, 1,000 years in exile or whatever, he comes back to the golden city of the gods, the Olympus type city. He returns from exile only to discover that like 3/4 of all the gods have been murdered by somebody, and the survivors all think he did it because he's Loki, right? He's the god of evil. And so the whole story is like a murder mystery where he's on the run trying to avoid being captured by the remaining gods who all think he's guilty, or they have their own agendas, obviously. And meanwhile, he's trying to find the real killer. And that book is enormously popular. People really enjoy that one because it's kind of a standalone, it's a murder mystery. It's a likable rogue on the run. Everybody's against him. The whole universe is against him. And plus, those kind of stories are usually set in contemporary times. But I set this one in the far future, so he has to deal with spaceships and planets and stuff like that. So once I wrote that, a whole sort of series kind of spun out of it. So now there's a trilogy. The second book after Lucian is called Baranak, Storming the Gates. And the third book that just came out last year is called Caroline, Heart Cold as Ice. And the conceit of these books is that each one is written in the first person from the point of view of that god. So each one of them is dealing with an issue, whether it be being accused of murder when you're innocent, or whatever else. They're each dealing with an issue, and it's from their standpoint as they kind of go from point A to B to C to D. So that's the 3 about the gods. And I also have several others that are more science fiction oriented, set within that same universe. So in other words, you get with Lucian, Baranak, and Caroline, you get the perspective of the gods and what they're up to. And in the other books, like Legion 1, Lords of Fire, Legion 2, Sons of Terra, Legion 3, Kings of Oblivion, and Hawk. In those, you get sort of the point of view of soldiers in this far empire, the generals, the foot soldiers, the lone secret agents, that kind of thing. So it's basically my big military space opera universe where I get to do stuff I wouldn't do very different from in a superhero universe. In fact, people have asked me, are you ever going to cross these over? And I'm like, well, it doesn't really work because the alien empires that show up in the Sentinels are kind of like the Kree or the Skrull or the Shi'ar, and they're comic book aliens, Mm-hmm. The alien empires that show up in the Shattering are more like you'd find in a Warhammer 40,000 novel. These are not the same style. It's not the same type of universe, and it just doesn't really kind of fit together. So.
You had mentioned some of your influences about, for the comic book or for the superhero movies or superhero books. What were your influences that you were drawing from for like Lucian and that?
Oh, yeah. For Lucian, it absolutely began with Roger Zelazny. I absolutely adore the Chronicles of Amber, Corwin, Merlin, and all those books. The idea of these sort of larger-than-life characters that are immortal and are telling us a story, but you don't know if you can trust them, the unreliable narrator. Mm-hmm. And so Lucian originally began as kind of my homage to my absolute idol of a writer, Roger Zelazny. He's by far my favorite writer. And so Caroline and Baranak both also have a lot of Zelazny and also some Vance, the Dying Earth type stuff kind of woven in. But when you get to the Legion books, the ones that are more about the soldiers in that universe, I guess there's a lot of kind of Dan Abnett and Graham McNeill, the British school of military science fiction. I always say I was having this conversation with David Weber at DragonCon a few months ago that there's really kind of an American school of military science fiction, and there's a British school. The American school is very influenced by the writers having probably been in Vietnam. It's very much about, we have this high technology, everything's shiny and neat, and we're going to go out, hoorah, and kick butt. The British school of military science fiction, though, is much more gothic. There's horror elements to it. There's class conflict elements. It's much more of a spooky kind of monsters. The aliens are monsters. They're not just warriors you have to fight in honorable duels like in the American version. And so I lean much more toward the British school, and I'm more influenced by the idea that the universe is this strange and dark place, and these armies that go out and confront the menaces are really basically in a horror movie as much as they are in a science fiction movie. So,
well, I'm just thinking, you're talking about all these novels. How do you manage to be so prolific?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I've actually been pretty slack this year. The one I failed, I always forget to mention this because the publisher hasn't officially released it yet. They just sent me a box of copies to take to Dragon Con last fall, knowing I would be there and could probably move a few, and I did. There's one more, and that's Alpha Omega. And I wrote that several years ago, and it was bouncing around publishers, and it ended up with Pro Se, with Tommy Hancock's Pro Se Productions and Pro Se Press. And I like to describe it as it's kind of like if you combine Space 1999 with the Severed Dreams episode of Babylon 5, where the Earth Force shows up to take over Babylon 5 and they have a civil war. Okay. So basically Alpha Omega is, there's a peaceful research base on a moon orbiting Alpha Centauri, and a ship shows up from Earth, a transport that's supposed to be bringing a changeover crew, right? Just replacement crew, take people back home, bring in a new crew. When the shuttles come, I'm just going to tell you the very beginning, when the shuttles come down and land, the shuttle doors open and all the base personnel are standing there on the landing pad waiting to welcome them. When the doors open, the Marines get out with machine guns and stuff and declare martial law and take over the base. And so when you're reading it, you're like, oh gosh, what's going on? Hopefully, right? Mm-hmm. And the thing you should be thinking is, are these good guys or are they bad guys, right? You don't know. Are the Marines here to take over because they're dictators, or are they here because there's something worse coming and they want to shore up the defenses before it gets here? So that's kind of the tease of Alpha Omega, which I think that Pro Se is going to release it, the official release, it's out in paperback on Amazon now, but they're going to put out the Kindle, the Audible, and do a kind of a splash thing for it in the next few weeks. But as far as prolific and like I say, I haven't done a lot this year. I'm currently working on the sequel to Vegas Heist called Miami Heist. But other than that, I've kind of slowed down. But really, over the last decade or so, I've tended to put out about 2 books a year. And it's usually just because I get so excited about it. I think it's a kind of combination. I always tell people, you need a combination of excitement about the thing you're working on, which will carry you a certain distance. But here's the problem with that, which I'm sure you've encountered writing stuff too, probably, is that enthusiasm and excitement will only carry you so far, because eventually you get distracted by something new. So when enthusiasm runs out, that's where professionalism has to take over, right? You have to be disciplined enough to tell yourself, you have to convince yourself, I'm still excited about this, right? I'm going to finish it. And then I'll start on that new thing. I have found throughout the last 10 or 15 years of writing that so much of writing is a mental game of convincing myself to be patient, because everybody gets excited on the new shiny thing, and you want to just keep dropping things halfway done and go start on the new one. Mm-hmm. And I can't tell you how many times I've been writing project A while much of my brain is going, oh, but I want to be working on B, and you have to be professional, because you have to tell yourself, look, if you don't finish A, you're never going to have anything, Yeah. So I think it really is being prolificness, if you like, is kind of equal measure of having inspiration and enthusiasm, and then being a professional enough to stick with it even when you get tired of it and make it as good as it can be. Would you agree with that?
I definitely agree. Yeah, there is always that. I don't know what it is. If you're writing something, there's always kind of whether you're reading a book or you see a movie or you just get some random idea while you're taking a shower or whatever, that just
Absolutely.
seems so exciting. Like, just seems more exciting than, whatever you're trying to do that day, even though what you're trying to do that day may be, the last few pages on a book that's almost finished or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I just take a lot of notes and set it aside and go, it's here when I'm ready. When I finish A, I've got lots of good notes about B. And then you just have to hope when you get to B that C doesn't come along and distract you again. So it's hard. It really is difficult. I mean, if it was easy, everybody would write 50 books a year. But you have to just learn that discipline and patience, I think.
What would you say to somebody who is, wanting to write their first novel, but they, maybe they've been, toying with the ideas for a long time, maybe, and they're coming to a point to where they're just like, okay, I'm going to do this. What advice would you give them?
That answer changes every year or so. And honestly, right now, my answer might be, what would make you think you should write a book in an environment where hardly anybody's reading anymore? It's really kind of depressing because sales across the board, it seems like, for books are down. You kind of have to love the medium and want to work in it, even if you're not going to get rich. And, there's a lot of us out there writing that aren't getting rich, but we do okay. I do okay with it. But I mean, my first thing would be to grab them and slap them in the face and go, find something more lucrative to do, man. But if they came back and said, no, I love writing just like you do, I love books just like you do, you got to help me with this, then I would say, all right, well, if you're determined, right? If you're determined and there's no dissuading you, then I would say this. I would say, focus on characters. Stories primarily are about characters and characters changing and growing. Now, to be fair, I do write a lot in pulp, and pulp tends to be more static, kind of like superhero stories or like comics, where you have the heroes, you have the villains, and they have various conflicts and adventures, and nothing really changes that much. But honestly, if you're going to write a novel, there needs to be some kind of development, right? Some kind of change between the first page and the last. Otherwise, it's boring. So I would say focus on characters, figure out how they change and evolve, and how their opponent, their antagonist, has something to do with that. It's not about just making up another fight scene and making up another description scene. Those are great. They have their place. But what motivates a reader, I think, to go through a book and not put it down is being interested in the characters and caring what happens to them in any setting. I mean, I'm just as happy to pick up a Michael Connelly book about Harry Bosch, being a detective in Los Angeles, as I am a Frank Herbert Dune book about some far distant, empire, or a Western, or a nautical, Patrick O'Brien nautical naval story. It's the trappings are nice, and the trappings are like what the shiny thing that catches our eye. Oh, it's a space opera. Oh, it's a Western. But I think that regardless of what it's about, you've got to know the characters inside and out and know why we should care about them. And once you know the characters, books tend to write themselves. It gets a lot easier. What's hard is writing stories where you don't know your own characters and you're having to force yourself to make up what happens to them. When you don't know them, you have to make them do stuff. But when you know them, when characters come alive, when you understand their depths and their contradictions, they will tell you what they're doing in the story, whether you like it or not sometimes. So that's I don't want to go on too long, but that's kind of my first step for potential writers is know your characters, know them inside and out. And Roger Zelazny used to say, write a little short story, even if you don't intend to publish it. Write a little short story where you just explore what your character does in a certain situation. And by the time you're finished with it, you could even throw it away if you want to, or you could incorporate it into your book. But when you're done with it, you know your character better than you did before. And it'll make it stronger and better, I think. And I've always thought that was pretty good advice.
Do you tend to plot out outlines in advance, or do you kind of discover things as you're writing?
This is a great point of discussion that Bobby Nash and and Sean Taylor and other pulp writers that I know and have worked alongside for many years. We've all done many conventions over the years and many panels about writing, about pulp and superhero and stuff. Mm-hmm. And we always end up, it's funny, like every convention, we always end up in this what they call plotter versus pantser conflict, because a lot of pulp writing is pants, by the seat of your pants, right? Kind of making it up as you go along. And I absolutely see the value in that, because it will be fresh. It's always based on inspiration, right? When you write as you go along, you are constantly being influenced by the newest inspiration that's hitting you. You're coming up with new, fresh ideas. And it's being motivated largely by what the characters want to do, because you haven't got a map. So they just have to go. And I get that. And in fact, I think that probably the most talented writer I know of that writes that way is Stephen King, right? Stephen King writes these 800-page books. He gives you like 200 to 300 pages of let's get to know the characters and see why you should care about them. And then the remaining 400 or 500 pages is now bad stuff happens to them. What are they going to do? And he basically makes it up as he goes along, but he knows the characters so well, and we've gotten to know them so well by that point that it seems organic and natural. What I've tended to do, though, I usually have several things in mind that I want to have happen in the story, and I can't trust myself. Usually, I can't trust myself that I'm going to hit all those road marks along the way. So I always say it's not that I intricately outline my books. It's that I like to have a nice roadmap. So let's say I'm going from New York to Los Angeles in my story, metaphorically, okay? I don't want to plan out every stop, every rest area, every place I'm going to eat in advance and never deviate. I don't like that. But what I do like is knowing I'll be in Pennsylvania at 3 o'clock and we'll look around there. And I'll be in Texas a couple of days from now and we'll look around there. So I like to have a loose outline that gives me a general idea of where the plot needs to go. And then I allow the characters as they develop in the story to veer me off down side roads and take me down, blind alleys maybe, and take me over to the Grand Canyon, take me over to Salt Lake City or something along the way. We still get to Los Angeles metaphorically, but I like to be loose enough with it that I don't prevent good things from happening organically along the way. I think that some of my best books are ones where I had a plan, and they say a plan never survives first contact with the enemy. In fact, I think Mike Tyson's corollary on that is everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. Yeah, and that's pretty much what it is as a writer. You have a plan, and then your characters punch you in the face, and so you kind of have to be flexible enough to go with that. So that's always been my approach. I like a little bit of both, I think.
No, that's good. And I've interviewed a number of novelists now, and there's always seems to be kind of a debate between the plotter and pantser thing. But most everybody seems to be a plotter. I haven't, or at least plotting out something.
Right.
I have yet to interview somebody who says they just sit down and start writing without any plan.
You have to have special talents, I think, to be able to do it 100%. But I will say this: one of the reasons I didn't mention that I think that having some kind of a roadmap is important is I like to do callbacks, and I like to set things up that pay off way later. And there's just no way I could trust my memory that if I'm writing chapter 2 in January, there's no way in July when I'm writing chapter 40 that I'm going to remember, to come back and revisit that thing from January. So it's much better that I lay all that out, and that way it's in my notes, it's in my loose outline, and I don't squander that opportunity to do something cool. Because how many times have you read a story or seen a movie or whatever where something pops up later and you're like, oh, they set that up, right? They had that in mind. It was all planned. And I'm like, I love that. Why would I want to miss the opportunity to do that? And it just seems like totally pantsing would make it a lot less likely that you'll remember to hit all those notes you want to hit. So.
Just for me, I've always thought about writing a novel, but I have not written a novel yet. But just thinking of some questions, I know some people there's always just some questions, just like, how do you know where to begin the story? Like what, because you could begin a story almost in any place. How do you know that the story begins with R2, D2, and C-3PO on the ship above Tatooine? How do you know it begins there?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I'm not sure I really have an answer because I don't know what other people would say, but for me, it's really just an instinct. I mean, I think when you've read enough books and seen enough movies and watched enough TV shows, you just have to learn to trust your instincts that what comes to you will work. And if your brain says start it here, just trust that that's, don't second guess. I think a lot of it is if you're probably starting out, your brain will tell you, oh, I should start with this scene. But then you think, well, wait a minute, why should I start with that scene? Am I sure it should start with that scene? How do I know it should start with that? And I think a lot of it is just second guessing your own instincts. I would just say, trust your instincts. If what comes to your mind is that it should start here at a certain place, then start there and see what happens. And if you feel later that you don't have enough information, that you needed a little bit before that, then either go back and change it a little bit or do a flashback or something. What I tend to do is, I get kind of an innate, when a story comes to me, when characters and a story come to me, I generally get an innate kind of a spidey sense feeling of where it should start. And I just trust that and go with it. And it's always worked out so far. Of course, I've also adapted a couple of my stories into comic book scripts. And when I did that, I picked very different places to start. And I think maybe it's because different types of stories in different media work better starting in different ways. The answer is not always the same, right? Like, for example, with Vegas Heist, I started out with the master, heist planner in his house, getting a phone call to have the heist proposed to him by another friend of his. And then you get the travel from there to where they meet up and they talk about the heist and they start putting the group together. In a novel, that longer form kind of works. But if you were reading a comic book, like a 60-page one-shot comic book about this heist, you wouldn't want the first 4 or 5 pages of the comic book to be them having a telephone conversation and then getting in a car and driving to the airport and all that, right? Mm-hmm. So in the comic book version, I started with them already all together in the car, heading down Route 66 to Vegas. And then you get a couple of panels of, we decided to get together to do this last week. We met up and here we are, So I think that there's different answers to that question depending on what it is you're writing, and it really is, a lot of it is just gut instinct, and don't be afraid to change it. Like the other one was Cold Lightning. I that's another like the Legion story, and in the novella, I start out with them getting together to go on a mission. In the comic, they're already on the mission, and there's flashbacks to how they each got together. So, because the comic form works better, making things compact and concise in that way. One other thing I'd say about how to start, I'm a big fan of starting right in the middle of the action and explaining anything that needs to be explained as you're on the run. I feel like the most boring novels are the ones where you start out with the info dump and you try to tell the reader a bunch of stuff that you think the reader needs to know. The reader doesn't need to know that at the beginning. The only thing the reader needs to know at the beginning is there's a character whose situation I should care about. That's it. The beginning of a novel, the only thing the reader needs to know is there's a situation going on here, there's a character in that situation, and I should care about them. Then I'll find out all the details as we're on the run. And so, for example, Hawk, my novel Hawk, which is set in that same Lucian universe, it starts out with the line, Hawk awoke naked and screaming in the heart of a shattered galaxy. Now, I feel like people that read that sentence are going to want to know more. Mm-hmm. It doesn't start out with Hawk was sitting on a spaceship. The spaceship was in the so-and-so Federation in such and such galaxy, which had 15 planets and an army. And there's nobody wants to read all that in the first paragraph, right? Get to the action. Hawk is naked and running down a hallway with aliens trying to kill him. We'll figure out who Hawk is and who the aliens are later, okay? So I'm a big proponent of starting a story with the action and then filling in the details as necessary and as concisely as possible.
No, I think that's great advice. Now, you had mentioned a while back, you had mentioned that you had self-published your first books. in, when you're talking to writers, there's still this kind of just this controversy about self-publishing versus going with a publisher or sending out query letters to agents and things and trying. Do you have any thoughts on, on self-publishing versus reaching out to publishers?
Yeah, the world has completely changed. The publishing world is completely different than it was even 10 or 12 years ago. And I get that a lot. And I totally understand people wondering about it and being confused, because the publishing industry changed so rapidly and so completely over the last decade or so that it kind of, if you weren't paying attention, you didn't even necessarily understand what was happening. Basically, what happened was that about 15 years ago, there were no Kindle. There was not much Audible, just CDs or tapes. Mm-hmm. And so everything was traditionally published. And if you wanted to get a book published, and a big traditional publisher or even a small press publisher, and there weren't that many of them, if they wouldn't take it under their wing and do it for you, you had to go find what was called at the time a vanity publisher and pay them to basically print your book and put it out there for nobody to buy it. There was no marketing. There was no demand. And it was expensive. That's pretty much gone. Anybody that's using vanity publishing today just doesn't understand the world anymore. That's like saying I'm going to go buy a new horse and buggy to go to work in. I mean, it's a different world now. What happened was about a decade ago, print on demand came along, where books can just pop out of a machine in 5 minutes and look just like the ones that were on the shelf already. And that kind of made publishing available to anybody. And then after that, of course, Kindle came along and made it even easier and less expensive. I would argue that Kindle and ebooks are basically the pulps of today, because pulp at the time was named after the cheapest way of printing something back in the 30s and 40s, which was on pulp paper that would fall apart and rot, very quickly, but it was cheap. Mm-hmm. And the cheap way to get something written, and I mean to buy something that's written today is on an e-reader, on a Kindle. So Kindle's basically the new pulp. But the thing that happened was, when print on demand and then Kindle came along, you got Amazon, CreateSpace, Lulu, and others, and their business model was completely different than vanity. Their business model is, you write something, we publish it, we print copies when people want to buy them, and you get the money. We'll Amazon gets some and you get some, or CreateSpace would get some and you get some, Lulu would get some and you get some. So you don't pay anybody with print on demand and Kindle. They pay you. It's the funniest thing. I would still, even a couple of years ago, I'd have people come up to me at conventions and say, how much money do you pay to put your books out? And how much money should I expect to have to pay to put my books out? And I was like, where do you work? Oh, I'm working in an insurance company. How much money do you pay your boss to let you come to work every day? What? Well, that's what you're asking me. I said, I'm doing the work. I get paid, right? And so print on demand and Kindle says, here's the product. If a customer wants to buy it, they buy it. And then we send the money at the end of the month to the author, to the artist, to the publisher. So that really upended everything, and it democratized publishing in a huge way. And it allowed writers that were writing things. See, here's the thing. You didn't just not get published because you were a bad writer, you in general. You also didn't get published if what you were writing was excellent, but didn't fit in with what publishers were printing or publishing. So, I wrote Lucian, and agents and publishers would write me back and say, this is incredibly well written. It's fantastic. We love the story, but it's fantasy and science fiction kind of combined, and we're just not really doing that right now. Roger Zelazny's dead, and we're not doing that right now. And so, I had to find, first through print on demand with and same thing with the Sentinels. They're like, well, we want to print Marvel superheroes. We want to make a contract with them. We don't want your characters nobody's ever heard of. So it lets you reach an audience. There's audiences out there for your work. It's just that print on demand and ebooks allow writers to reach an audience that traditional publishing simply was not serving. And it's a smaller number of people. It's just like with podcasts, right? Podcasts allow you to reach a smaller number than a radio station, necessarily a big radio station, but still a substantial audience. Mm-hmm. So there's not that much difference between podcasting and print on demand or Kindle publishing, in that in both cases, you're using your own technology and the internet to reach people that want your product, but that a big conglomerate doesn't make a big enough profit off of to serve. I think the day is coming when television might even get that way, when it becomes so incredibly cheap to do special effects and stuff on your computer. You see it with YouTube now, right? I mean, all these YouTubers are people that could have never gotten a network TV show, but they make $1 million posting YouTube videos. So we just live in an age now where it's so much easier to get your creations to the public than it used to be, whether it be books or videos or podcasting or whatever. And it's a wonderful new world. And of course, the downside to it is that with the fewer gatekeepers, there's a lot more crap, right? But that just means that you got to really make yourself stand out even more. And so marketing becomes even more important. But I think it's all entirely positive. I love that I live in a world where you and I can do podcasts and I can write books and I can find an audience, even if some big conglomerate in New York or Chicago doesn't think they'll make $1 million off of it.
No, I absolutely agree. And, just to address some of the points that you were talking about, because I publish books for tabletop role-playing games,
right.
Resource books for tabletop role-playing games. And, my first book that I published, except for, if you subtract out my time, it cost me $12 to publish because I bought a $12 image to go on the cover.
There you
go. And it's just like, I just don't think people realize that you can publish a book. If I would have gotten a free image, I could have published a book for no outlay of cash at all, just my time.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And then some of your other points too. I think you were saying yes that some books just don't get published, not because they're all poorly written. I just think of the story of Robert Heinlein with Starship Troopers when he took it to his original publisher who was publishing his books and they didn't want it. And you're like, are you kidding me? That book is amazingly written, but why didn't they want it? Well, they didn't think it fit their audience.
Exactly.
Right? So he had to take it to a different publisher, which kind of blows my mind because anybody would want to publish that book.
Let me give you an example. Do you know that Dune, which is about to have its third incarnation of a movie or TV show, and it's considered the greatest, science fiction novel, some would consider the greatest of all time. Mm-hmm. Do you know that when Frank Herbert sent it in to all the different publishers, they all turned it down, and it ended up being published by a small company that printed auto repair manuals?
I did not.
So I mean, even Dune, even Dune had a hard time. Yeah. So I mean, I've probably sold more copies of Lucian than Dune sold its first 2 or 3 years. It's hard to fathom that, but that's the world we live in.
Yeah, and then too, I know I had interviewed Matt Forbeck, who's a New York Times bestselling author, and he talked about how he didn't even think that the whole genre of lit RPG would have been created by publishers, that it just sprang up because there was an audience demand for it and independent self-publishing authors found that.
Yes, that's a great example. Yeah, I mean, enough people read Ready Player One and wanted more, and Klein's taking his sweet time, and so yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that it's funny you mentioned that. That's something I would love to work in. Ready Player One is my favorite book of like the last 5 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. But man, that's just another one of these genres that I like to consider myself flexible. But there are a lot of genres out there that it would be hard for me at least to get my brain into it. So much respect to people that can do that.
Well, yeah, no, because most of my audience would play tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons?
Oh yeah. In high school all the time, sure thing, and loved it. And I went and when Stranger Things came along and my kids saw it, they wanted to try it out, so we ran out and got a box set of the basic game to kind of try again. And over the years, I've done a good bit of that kind of thing. I have great appreciation for it and enjoyment. I also like the collectible card games too. I was a big Babylon 5 card game player, and I even have there's even a collectible card game for the Sentinels that's out there on my website. So yeah.
Okay. No, that's great. Did Dungeons and Dragons affect you as a storyteller in any way?
I don't know. I think that it was just one more thing when I was a teenager that allowed me to see how stories can come together and evolve organically, and how, rather than different characters affecting the flow of the story, actual human beings sitting around you, can do that. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned as a creative person doing an exercise like that. I'm not a huge RPG person. I probably would do it more if I could, but I think there's a lot to it. I know that Larry Niven, for example, that wrote Ringworld and all that, he has always been a big role-playing game player, and he got a lot of his inspiration for some of his later novels in like the 80s and 90s and 2000s from the games that he and his friends in California would play.
I find it's just fascinating that so many of the authors that I have interviewed, they have all played Dungeons and Dragons or something similar at some point, and I just think it's fantastic. But Van, where can people learn more about you and find your books?
Well, there's if you go to my central hub, www.plexico.net, Plexico, P as in Paul, Plexico. Like Mexico with a PL, Plexico.net. If you go there, there's links to my books. There's links to that card game. There's links to all my podcasts. I do a weekly football show, which your audience probably is not as excited about, I'm sure. But I do a semi-regular show called the White Rocket Podcast, where I interview different authors and other folks, and we have conversations about movies and TV and books and comics and stuff. We did a whole series of episodes on Game of Thrones when it was on, and we did. I have a whole James Bond show called On Her Majesty's Secret Podcast, where I and a bunch of other guys, including Raymond Benson, the author of several of the Bond novels, are on there talking about the James Bond movies. Alan J. Porter from Bond Lexicon is on there. So I have basically three different shows, two of which you guys would be interested in: the White Rocket Podcast and On Her Majesty's Secret Podcast. And those are there. You can find links and audio players there, and also the books, and then my various convention appearances, because I do Dragon Con in Atlanta every year. I do Windy City in Chicago, and I do Archon in St. Louis, and a number of other conventions around the country. And so you can check out my schedule there and see where I'm going to be, and come up and have a nice chat. I'd be delighted to meet you guys and chat with you and everything. It'd be great.
Okay, well, Van, I will link up your website and your books in the show notes to this episode at dicegeeks.com, so everybody can find them. So, Van, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, it was absolutely a blast. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my interview with Van today. As I mentioned in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, I have provided links to Van's novels. You definitely want to go over and check those out. Now, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free, and you will get 10 free dungeon maps. Plus, you will never miss an episode of this show. Now, it is my privilege to bring you a new guest each and every Wednesday. And if you guys listening would leave reviews, tell your friends, and consider supporting on Patreon, all of those things would just ensure that I would be able to keep making these episodes. I truly thank you for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.